Picture this. Several blind people come up to an elephant and just start touching it all over the place to try to learn what it's like. Each one feels a different part of that elephant. One feels the side, another feels the tusk, a third one will feel the trunk and the leg and an ear and so on. When they're asked what an elephant is like, one might say, "Oh, an elephant, that's like a wall." And another will say, No, it's more like a spear. And a third one will say, "No, an elephant is like a snake or a tree or a fan," and so on. So they argue and argue and argue, unable to agree, until someone comes along and believes all of them, trying to put together a more complete, holistic description that goes beyond the limits of those individual perceptions. That's what integral theory is all about. Integral theory starts with the premise that no earnest human endeavor for truth can be 100% wrong. None of those blind people are 100% wrong about the elephant. After all, to be 100% wrong, you'd have to know what 100% right is, and just do the opposite of that. So everything has a kernel of truth. Every perspective brings some insight that we can glean and learn from. And now that we are solidly in the information age with the internet, it is easier than ever to investigate, compare, and contrast different perspectives and see the bigger picture. And that, seeing the bigger picture, is exactly what integral is all about. The most robust integral model that we have comes from the philosopher Ken Wilber. A lot of what I'll share with you today and throughout this course is adapted from his thinking, particularly his books, A Theory of Everything, Integral Spirituality, and The Religion of Tomorrow. Integral theory has a lot to say about all the many ways that consciousness can wake up, grow up, show up, and clean up. But today, as a very brief introduction, I want to focus on the stages of growing up. Like I mentioned before, I believe that the Spirit is calling Christianity as a religion to play a major role in our collective growing up process. And this is by far one of the most compelling frameworks for that endeavor. Have you ever noticed how a child's understanding of the world changes as that child grows? They start seeing beyond their immediate needs, and they begin to understand others' perspectives. This journey of growth doesn't really stop in childhood. In fact, it continues throughout our lives, and we can make progress well into adulthood, especially if pursued with intention. Today, I want to talk about the integral concept of altitudes. What are altitudes? Well, it's a system of stages that explains how people tend to grow and develop over time. There's a lot of research that goes into this, so I'm going to break it down. Many different developmental psychologists have come up with their own stage models. These are the stages that typical people ordinarily go through as they develop. For example, you might be familiar with Piaget's model of childhood development. Or if you're into psychology, you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those are just two very popular models of how we grow up. Ken Wilber looked through over 100 of these frameworks for developmental psychology. And here's what he noticed. He realized that different disciplines would subdivide these development spectrums into different numbers of stages. So anywhere from 4 stages to a dozen stages. And of course, each niche area of study is going to have its own name for all these different levels. But when Wilber overlaid all of these scales one on top of each other, he realized that they describe a growth process that goes through very similar sets of characteristics and behaviors. So, Wilber synthesized all of that research into what we call altitudes of development. And here in this video and integral theory at large, we refer to each altitude by a different color so that it's easier for us to remember what they are. This whole way of looking at human development through stages isn't super in vogue in academia right now, because inevitably, when we do that, it stratifies people into these hierarchical categories. And in general, in academia and colleges, universities, today, those institutions are very critical of hierarchies. But it's important to understand that one stage is not better than the other. In fact, higher stages, higher altitudes are fundamentally dependent on the existence and on the healthy development of those lower stages that come before it. The point of creating a composite map of these different levels is not to pigeonhole, not to judge or label or develop a prejudice about people. The point is to help us increase our understanding, increase our care and compassion, increase our capacity to communicate with people who are at different stages from our own, who might be in different levels. People who operate from higher stages can typically see further structures that are not available to those below, so that's true. And they'll also have a different set of values, a different set of tools that start to come online at higher levels. There's often conflict between people who think and operate from these different levels because their worldviews seem utterly incompatible. But if we zoom out, we realize that these altitudes are actually necessary and function as an interdependent web. Here's what these look like. Across the bottom of this graph, we have a few of those different developmental models. All of these different researchers looked at their own area of expertise to see how children, entire societies, individual self-identity, worldviews, and even faith can develop over time. And they each have a model with different names for each stage, as you can see. But to make it easier to talk about each level, instead of having us memorize all these different names, in this series, we will refer to them with the colors infrared, magenta, red, amber, orange, green, and teal. You don't have to memorize it all right now. We'll keep revisiting these concepts. We'll do a deeper dive into each one of those colors in the upcoming videos. But for now, it's useful to think of it this way. In terms of values, humans tend to progress from impulsive to self-protective, and then growing up to conformist values, then to conscientious values, to individualistic, and eventually to integrated and beyond. And in Christianity, we can even see those values and perspectives being expressed in different forms of Christianity, which we're calling miracle Christianity, that grows into a warrior Christianity, that in turn goes into a traditional Christianity, into rational Christianity, into pluralistic Christianity, and into integral Christianity and beyond. I'm really excited to dissect what all of that means. But before we do that, I need to explain the structure of all these different altitudes so that we're all on the same page. Let me give you some analogies that will quickly help us grok the concept of altitudes and avoid some common pitfalls in understanding them. Here's a really helpful way to think about this, is these Russian nesting dolls, where each new stage is actually a layer that envelops all the previous stages that come before it. And this concept of transcending and including the previous, it both pierces beyond the previous limits, but also relies on what's most useful from what came before. So think about, for example, the person that you were 5, 10, 15 years ago. You were a complete person with your own way of seeing the world, your own needs and desires, your own opinions and priorities, all of that. But since then, you've built layers on top of the person that you were. And hopefully, those layers have brought some more insight and a wider perspective. You have a little bit more wisdom as you grow up. And maybe you've shed some parts of yourself that you no longer serve you, that you're no longer expressing to the world, while you're continuing to develop parts of yourself that are still important to you. So this is a good way to conceptualize these different altitudes of development, that each layer both transcends and includes the previous one. Another really helpful way to think about this growing up process is that it is mimetic. What does that mean? It spreads through repeated mimicking of certain patterns. So there is a fractal nature to these stages. So you go through all these different stages as your own individual consciousness grows up, but these stages also show up as you grow in your moral intelligence and your emotional intelligence and your interpersonal intelligence. Even in your spirituality, you're going to see that it goes through these specific stages and these specific characteristics. And then if you zoom out even more and you look at groups of people like churches or even the whole of humanity, we can recognize the same pattern, the same stages showing up again in collective growth through these altitudes. It just happens over a much larger time span. So when I say mimetic, I mean that it's fractal. It shows up at different levels of zooming in and zooming out. But when I say that growing up is mimetic, I also mean that there's no way to just flip a switch that will graduate someone from one level to the next. Instead, it's usually a gradual, slow, sometimes messy process of sorting out a lot of cognitive dissonance. Someone might be in one particular level for a very long time, mastering all that that level has to offer, before one day, the seeds of the next level start to sprout. We like to say that's when the next level first comes online. But that doesn't mean that they're suddenly in that next level, because then there will be a while before that next level is fully taking root and begins to blossom. And that usually only happens when the current level enters some sort of crisis, some transformational dilemma, where the familiar ways of thinking, doing, and becoming are no longer working. If you're a parent, or if you're a gardener, or if you have any other vocation where you get to observe growth firsthand, you know how intricate and complicated this whole process of growing up can be. So there's all this complexity and all this nuance on the micro level in terms of what stage and what altitude you are expressing. But it's only when you zoom out that you realize that people actually usually will have a center of gravity in one or two altitudes that they're most comfortable operating from. For example, no one is strictly just one altitude. No one is just orange or just amber or just red. Someone's center of gravity might be an orange, for example, but they can express green in certain social contexts, or they tend to show up as a red in their political views, etc. The same goes for churches. On a big picture scale, your church might have its center of gravity in amber, but perhaps the sermons are a little bit more orange. Perhaps your liturgies are actually more amber. Some of the most dynamic deacons in your congregation might actually largely be in the red altitude. And some of the younger members that start coming to your church might bring more of a green perspective. So we take all of that into consideration, because in this video series, I will paint with a very broad brushstroke to help us get acquainted with this model. Keep in mind that it's tempting, and in fact, it's so easy for each level to think the only one that's correct is my level, where I'm at right now. So for example, a man whose center of gravity is an orange may look at all the previous levels, magenta, red, and amber, as childish or not good enough, forgetting that nobody is born into orange, and that one day he also used to think, act, and live from those previous levels. That same orange man will hear the descriptions of green and teal and beyond, and he'll be resistant to the ideas that challenge the pillars that uphold the orange status quo. That's normal, but my invitation is for you to listen with an open mind, to realize that Christ meets us at every single level of growing up. And remember that every one of these stages brings many gifts and many needs. And that leads me to my next and last point about the nature of these altitudes. And this is important to keep in mind. All of this that we're covering today and throughout this course, this is simply a map. And the map is not the territory. Yes, it's true that this roadmap is immensely robust and super detailed, and this course is only going to scratch the surface of this deep, deep discipline called integral theory. But at the same time, human development itself, both on the individual and on the collective dimension, is incalculably complex with millions of shifting variables. So take that with a grain of salt, because still, it's much better to navigate the territory with the simplified map in hand than to do it with no map at all. Now that we have a general sense of what the altitudes are, let's go through each one of the existing altitudes and look at some of their defining characteristics. If you've learned something today, and if you're enjoying this course so far, leave me a comment, drop me a like, and subscribe for the next videos. One love.